Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Arena Lights LLC, and it is an honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav HaShalom, Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav HaShalom. It's also in schus and merit of Rabbi Zevi Cheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz L'Erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. So we're in the middle of Perikei Beis, chapter 12, a chapter about the Benoni. Remember that Tanya Sefer Shel Benoni. After speaking about the Tzaddik in chapter 10 and the Rosh in chapter 11, now comes the Benoni. And the Benoni is the most paradoxical and complex personality. The Tzaddik is someone who the entire divine soul has entirely conquered, entirely dominates his life. Only godliness, a singularity. In that itself, there are levels of it. Tzaddik Gomer, Tzaddik She'ena Gomer, as we discussed back then. The Rasha is someone where you have two forces at work, the animal soul and the divine soul. And sometimes the divine soul dominates, sometimes the animal soul. I mean, to use the example that he gave of the two kings battling over the Irktana, the small city. So think of it like I don't want to say the word democracy, but think of it of two opposition parties. In this case, one is the divine soul, one is the animal soul, and they both have control. They don't have control at the same time, because you can't be thinking, speaking, and acting at the same time, both following the divine soul and the animal soul, but they both can control and do control at different times our thought, speech, and action. And as he explained, and that defines the different levels depending how much they control and how often and how frequent or infrequent, again as discussed earlier in chapter 11. The Benoni, is the interesting thing here is the two forces are there. There's the king, the divine soul, there's the animal soul. They're both active. However, who rules and governs the city? Only one party, the divine soul. Meaning the thought, speech, and action of the person is completely controlled by the divine soul. But there is an opposition with a voice. By the tzaddik, the opposition has been either entirely transformed or almost entirely transformed. No opposition at all. In the Rasha, the opposition actually governs and affects the person in reality, in expression, in thought, speech, or action. All three or one of the three. By the Benoni, who's governing the person? Divine soul. But the animal soul is very active. And the Benoni basically has to be constantly at war to quell it and keep it at bay. That's essentially, as we learned so far in chapter 12. To use the expression of the Alter Rebbe, meaning forever. The negative energy, the selfish energy of the animal soul is not strong enough to conquer the slabish beguf lachtiye, to manifest in his body and cause him to sin, to transgress. Which means the hainusha shleisha levusha nefesh abamis, which means that the three garments of the animal soul, shehem machshava dibur ma'isa shemitzad klipa, ein graven bei al a nefesh alikis lisabish beguf, b'meyach u'b'peh b'shar machivorim. So that means that yes, the forces are there. There's an opposition voice, but it's not enough to impact the thought, speech, and action of the person. So which garments control the person? They're the garments of the divine soul, not of the animal soul. Agav, I don't know if it's Agav incidentally, but maybe it's part of the subject. Here, it seems, we discussed this topic back when we first began learning about the garments, and the question was, just like we know there are 10 divine faculties of the divine soul, 10 faculties of the animal soul, but we don't say there are 20 faculties in the person. because the divine soul and the animal soul come and meet together. But the fact is, however, they are different faculties, because the faculty Chachma Bina Das, for example, or Chesed Gvura Teferes, of the divine soul are only interested in the divine. Chachma Bina Das, intelligence and emotions of the animal soul, are interested in its own selfish survival, its own needs. How about the garments? Are there 3 garments? They also join together. And let me step back a minute. And these 2 sets of 10 faculties join together. What do I mean join together? It's one person. We're not made up of 20 faculties. We're made up of 2 souls, each one with their faculties. So even when the divine soul's faculties are functioning, there's animal soul's faculties, but the question of expression is the key here. Thought, speech, and action. And there you can only wear one garment. Is it a garment of the divine soul, or is it a garment of the animal soul? So is it 2 sets of garments, or is it one set of garment which is controlled depending on the person, whether it's the tzaddik and the rasha we spoke about? But in the Benoni, the garments are controlled by the divine soul. So here when you read it, it sounds like the 3 garments of the animal soul don't have any expression. But then, do they exist? So you have to say potentially they exist, because there are faculties of that animal soul. But this needs further discussion and further analysis. Because if they don't express themselves, actually we have a koyach, potentially 3 garments. But he does say the shleisha levushim, so you could also interpret it very balbatish, and basically it means that the animal soul doesn't have expression in the garments are essentially garments that are clean garments of the divine soul, not the soiled garments of the animal soul. So it could be the same garments. The question is, who's dominating them? So rak shleish levushim nefesh l'kishem levadim islapshem beguf, and that's machshava dibur u'maisa, thought, speech, and action of the tayag shal yayag mitzvus hatera. Okay, that's the definition of the Benoni. So we see the paradoxical element. There's opposition, but the divine soul is the one that controls the expression, the governance. So think of it using the example again of the city. You can have 2 parties in a government, and one is the majority, and they rule and govern. But the minority has a voice, but they can't govern. They can't rule. It never follows their rulings. Just as an example. That's the Benoni. By the Rasha, just by contrast, no, both of them can govern. And both of them have not just a say, but actually can affect the person in thought, speech, and action. By the tzaddik, the opposition has completely been eliminated or transformed entirely. Okay. Now the Alter Rebbe continues. It doesn't just stop here. He says the next part, we're summing up what we learned till now. So, first he spoke in Asay Tev, so to speak. Which garments? The divine soul's garments dominate. Thought, speech, and action. Not just dominate, are the only ones. Hu levade. It says, Heim levade mislapshem beguf. So the only ones that control the actual expression, whether it's what you think about, what you speak about, or what you do, is the divine soul. But he wants to also drive the point home that the animal soul not only does it not affect the thought, speech, and action, but loy ovar avera meyama v'loy yaver le'elam. He never did an avera and never will do one. And he continues, v'loy nikra lav shem rosh afilu shah achaz v'rega echad kol yomov. And he's not called a rasha, even 1 hour, 1 moment in his life. Shah can mean hour, can mean ker, 1 movement, but essentially any interval of time. What is coming to say here? Because you could think, 1 second, maybe that's the primary function of the Benoni, the primary personality of the Benoni. But maybe there are times he may slip. You could say that the divine soul controls the thought, speech, and action, but who says it's exclusive? You can have an opposition party that does not govern, but maybe once in a while they get a word in and they do have an effect on the governance, in this case, thought, speech, and action. So he says no. He never does an Aveda. And when he means he's not Aveda, it means machshava dibur ma'asim, in thought, speech, and action. And even 1 second, 1 moment, you can't call him a Rasha. Because by Rasha, that's where you have even one slip. If a person, in other words, does once anything wrong in thought, speech, and action, that's already in the category of a rasha. Kol Yomov. That's what he says. So, of course, we need to understand this, because later in chapter 14, again, we've reviewed this, but it's always good to refresh. He says, Midas Kol Adam, Midas Habenis, Midas Kol Adam, everybody. Every person, any given moment, he also uses, every moment a person can become a Benoni. He says that explicitly in chapter 14. How's that possible? If a person did one Aveda, whenever it was, because he doesn't just say he doesn't do in the future. So the Rebbe explains, and you have to say this, that this is referring to that he's in such a state right now that no matter what would come his way, he wouldn't do an Aveda. He may have done something, but he's been transformed. We're not talking about a Rasha who yesterday did something wrong, God forbid, and today he has regrets, as we learned, and actually corrects his ways and does something good. But he's not been transformed. He's not in a different state. He's still a Rasha, but a Rasha doesn't mean he's doing only bad things. And then tomorrow, God forbid, he could again transgress, as we see for most human beings. A Benoni, no. He's in a state that right now, it's not shaykh. It's completely mufrach. It's completely not possible. Because he's transformed himself. In other words, if he never did an Aveda, never will do, that's a poshet pshat. But that's not so common. But if he transforms himself with true tshuva, as we discussed at length in the previous shiur, in previous classes, then he's now in a state of a Benoni, not a rasha. You'll say tomorrow something happens. That happens not because he's in a state of a rasha, is because whatever reason something happens, and then again he can do the tshuva. They have to say that's the pshat. Now you'll say, what happens? So what is this? Just semantics? Person every day does something wrong. You'll say, no, he was really a Benoni. Well, this is the Hebrew knows what's going on in the heart of a person and knows the matzav. We're not here to judge anyone, because externally, as long as a person's thought, speech, and action are doing the right thing, we can't know. Maybe it's a rasha that happens to behaving this way. How do you know? Maybe it's a Benoni. So that requires, of course, only the Eibishter who knows and understands B'ich and Lev and understands what's going on in a person can establish which state it is. So the point in Tanya here is not coming to give us that we're meant to be inspectors and go check out who's a Benoni or who's not a Benoni. He's defining the status of this and this person. Okay. Now, then the Alter Rebbe continued, and we continued learning what comes next. Ach muhus va'atzmus is the next part. So we have so far the structure of the chapter. One is defining the Benoni, where the thought, speech, and action are completely controlled by the divine soul. Number two, this status, that his very being, it's not just his behavior, his very being is a different type of personality, which is a level of Aveda. It's not just somebody who does something wrong sometimes and does something right sometimes. He's a different status, and that's he's reached that place where we're going to learn how he does it, but he has that control. The next piece, the core essence of the divine soul. We're not talking now about the garments. The garments are controlled by the divine soul. But the core, which is Shehein Eser B'chineseh, which is its 10 faculties, its 10 levels, when it came to the garments, the divine soul controls. Not dominates, controls completely. But when it comes to the faculties, to the very etzem mahus, they're not the only ones that have govern and control the city. Control the governance, yes, control the behavior, control the thought, speech, and action. But they're not the only ones that have a melucha there. They're not the only ones that have a say. Ki'im, bi'itim uzumonim, only certain times. But before I continue, which means that the animal soul also has a say. However, the person is strong enough, the Benoni that is, to not allow the animal soul to impact thought, speech, and action, as we'll soon learn. But now the Alter Rebbe not digresses, adds another scenario. Because to really be realistic, during the day, there are different states of being. Even by a Benoni, who has this control, there are different times. So he brings now what happens during davening. So during davening, the divine soul now has an additional strength. It says, vitum uzumonim, certain times, like during Krishma, Vitfila, which is a time, an opportune time, a special energy rate. Shas meich shehi, shas meich in the gadas lamaila, v'gam lamata, hi shas akesha l'chol adam. So we discussed the time manifest energy. It's a specific energy. Just like Shabbos and Yontiv has its power, so too during Shishma and Tefillah, lamaila and lamata, above and below. It's an opportune time. And what happens during davening? There's an additional power, additional surge. In addition to the time itself during the Zman Tefillah, Zman Krishma, there's that power, but then the person acts on it. What does he do? He davens by binding his chabad, by concentrating and focusing his das in the awesome greatness of godliness, and it also la'erer stimulates the love that burns like a fire in the right side of his heart. So all day the divine soul controls the three garments. But by davening now we have something more. The faculties of the divine soul have come alive. In the mind, in the emotions, both mitzad l'mayla, that is, because it's a special time, and then when we use that time, by actually focusing, l'haimik daite, both meichin and midas, with our minds and our emotions, to do what? L'dofka b'kiyim ateiru mitzvuseh ma'ava, to cling, to attach, to cleave to God through the performance of Torah and mitzvahs, ma'ava, with love, the ava kirish be'esh, like we say, v'haftas Hashem alakecha, which is zeu inyan amavur b'krishma. That's the Teichen of Krishma. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Baruch Shem. Then we talk about v'hafta, then we talk about mitzvahs. So that's what's explained in Krishma, which is the Raisa and the Brichas Krishma before Shema and afterwards, which is the Rabbanon, which are Achana L'Krima Krishma. All this is this special time during davening, during Krishma. And that, then, there's additional power. So what he said before, that two things now. That first of all, in the Benoni, the garments are controlled by the divine soul exclusively. However, the very faculties themselves, they're not, the divine soul is not the only one that has a say. We also have an animal soul that's speaking. Though it's kept at bay, meaning it's not acted upon or spoken on or thought about because of that control. But during davening, an additional power comes to the divine soul. And then the Ra, not just the faculty, not just the garments are controlled by the divine soul, but the very Ra in the left side of the heart is subjugated and nullified to the right side of the heart where the divine soul rests. Because at that time, what's your mind involved in? Not just that you control, your mind is involved in thinking about God. So all day long, not during davening, it's also the divine soul controls the thought, speech, and action. But now when you're actively, the faculties of the divine soul are active, both mind and heart, so then that further pushes aside. So even the voice of the animal soul is temporarily suspended. So talk again the example of the melucha of the Irktana. Think of a government that has two parties. So who controls what the country or the city will do? That's controlled by the animals, by the divine soul in the Benoni. But the opposition has a voice, and they get up and say their voice. However, you never follow that voice. But then there's a time where that voice is also quieted down by davening. That's the example here. Aval achrat tefillah. That's during davening. But after davening, bistalkos hamechen the godless ain't saved baruch hu. When the mechen, what we said, remember shas mechen the godless, that special energy, the door closes, and it's no longer flowing. And therefore, also below, we don't have that shas hakesha anymore. That opportunity, that window of opportunity or door of opportunity, has closed. That doesn't mean it's not existent, but for all practical purposes, it's not now radiating in a way that we can access it. So So now the Ra, that in a sense has gone to sleep, has been silenced. It returns and wakes up again. And now the voice of the opposition is speaking again. However, the divine soul still controls the thought, speech, and action. What does that mean when it speaks its voice? Not just in speaking, it's desiring. It's desiring the desires of this world and its pleasures. However, remember this is the Benoni. So now he says, and this is where we continue learning, and just again summing it up, because this is so fundamental. So now he goes the other way. Before he said that the divine soul is not the only one that has a say in the Benoni. Now he's saying, Mamash the same lashon he said before. He said the Edison mohus. What was the language? That the divine soul, its very faculties, its very essence, is not the only one. When he means essence here, he means obviously the essence. He says the 10 faculties, because sometimes they're called essence compared to the garments. Even though essentially you can say the divine soul has an essence, then there is the faculties of the divine soul. Chapter 2, chapter 3 of the faculties, and then the garments. But relative to the garments, sometimes we refer to the koiches hanefesh as atzmus muhus va'atzmus nefesh. He speaks about this in Torah Pasha Vayera. Okay? So now he says the other way around, that even though after davening the animal soul's desires awaken again, but since they're not the only ones that have mishpat, cannot bring it out and to actualize from potential to actual. But there is a potential, and there's a voice. Whereas during davening, even the voice has been subdued. It's like has been numbed, if you wish, to animal soul's desires. Like he said at the beginning of the chapter, that there's not enough power for it to come into actualization. Which means what? Into action, speech, and thought. To immerse himself with his thought in the pleasures of this world. How to fulfill this desire? So a voice of desire is there, but it does not have, because the divine soul is active, doesn't have enough power to actualize. So it's like the voice of the opposition, but it can't actualize that voice in the actual governance of the city, of the small city. And now comes the next piece that we began learning. This is the last thing we learned. And why? What is it about? What's the secret here? We know it's not just magic. We know it's not just an accident. What is the power of the Benoni that the Rasha is not accessing? So he introduces now the power of moyach shalat al lev. Ki moyach shalat al lev. The brain rules over the heart. Mind over the heart. Remember, the mind is the reflective mind that we learned about in chapter 9. The heart is impulsive. So you have these two voices. The animal soul rests in the left side of the heart, which is impulsive, follows whatever whims and desires it has on its own. The divine soul resides in the mind, the reflective mind, which in turn manifests in the right side of the heart. So it's not driven by the passions, by impulsive passions. but controlled by the divine soul, and therefore divine emotions, feelings of love, which are very deliberate, directed toward the purpose of its existence, that now dominates. The brain rules over the shalit. Interesting word, because remember, we're talking about like melucha, mamshala. We're talking about rulers, kings who are ruling over the city. That's the initial example the Alter Rebbe gave back in chapter 9. So moyach shalat al alev. So though these two forces oppose each other, and in the Rasha, one can control and the other one can control, and kishazek comes and nefil, as we learned, like the battle between Yaakov and Esav. However, there's another additional component that we need to take into account. And he brings Kamesha Kosha Bezer Pashas Pinchas. The Moech Shalta Alev, and the Alter Rebbe adds, B'teil Dosei V'teva Yitzirosei. Critical piece. So now we have another additional asset, that the mind has natural control, a natural dominance. He says two expressions, B'teil Dosei, it's inherent, V'teva Yitzirosei. So you could be born something with its inherent, but it's not necessarily your nature. It's inherent. He says not just that, but it's your natural capacity. Teva Yitzirosei. Meaning it's who you are. It's not some acquired skill. Shekach Neitzer Adam B'Tel Dosei, as the Alter Rebbe even more. For that is how a man is formed at birth. We probably need explanation, understanding all three. Tel Dosei, Teva Yitzirosei, Shekach Neitzer Adam B'Tel Dosei. So he's really spelling it out. The simple reason is because this is so critical. Because if it was an acquired skill, how could an acquired skill that comes through education and superimposed be more powerful than a natural faculties of the animal soul? You could say the divine soul has natural faculties that are divine. The animal soul has natural faculties that are selfish. One is driven by the reflective mind, one is by the impulsive heart. But who says one is more naturally more powerful than the other? To say adds no. So Mayach Shalta Alev is part of the very nature. Just like the faculties are natural, so too is the control. And you can access it at any time. Like he says afterwards, Shekol Adam Yochel B'Ritzeinu Shebemeichel Yisapik Limshel Beruach Tevoseh Shebelibei. A person could always, with the willpower of his brain, his mind, his reflective mind, restrain himself and take control over his heart's urges and desires. So though we've learned this already, going over it again is very helpful. So let's think of it as a review of what we learned about the Benoni, and we'll stop here, and we'll continue in the next year. TanyaApplied.com is our website where you can find this and all previous programs, as well as submit questions. Everyone have a good day.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.